Hello, everyone. The self in the crisis. Crisis of the self. The self of an individual is not set in stone. It is true that as humans we can develop an understanding about ourselves because we have a so-called reflexive self-consciousness, which is our ability of an external position. We can recognize ourselves in the mirror, think about ourselves, and treat ourselves like an object. But this image we have of ourselves can change. It also depends on how others see us and which sociocultural view of humanity prevails. Despite these interpersonal and socio-cultural influences, we have a knowledge of ourselves that we take for granted. This self-concept or self-image guides us. It gives us security and makes us balanced as long as it's relatively stable and congruent with our current experience. Even a negative self-image creates a certain amount of security, which is why dysthemic patients, for example, find it difficult to let go. If new impressions and circumstances force us to correct our self-image, or it breaks down, we are usually restless, depressed, or dissociated. One can rightly claim that the self is only a construct that we or our brain creates. But this so-called construct has far-reaching consequences. We are, after all, special living beings who are not only guided by impulses, drives, and instincts, but who can also reflect themselves. This characterizes the human context. This is what makes us creative, but also vulnerable. We question ourselves and feel ashamed, but we can also draw consequences and correct ourselves. We can deliberately discriminate against others and see only our own advantage, but we can also reflectively recognize our own guilt and try to put things right. When we talk about the self, including self-realization, self-responsibility, self-empowerment, and self-optimization, then this self-relationship resonates, which is our gift and our destiny. We cannot tolerate very well when our image of ourselves is in crisis, especially when we have to acknowledge that we are not the way we had taken ourselves for granted. The mismatch between pre-existing self-understanding and new self-perceptions gives rise to a malaise of disappointment, anger, or in particular shame, which is unique to human beings. Even without using any psychoanalytical terms such as self-ideal, superego, or narcissism, a distortion of our self-image is always disturbing. We immediately lose our footing or our balance. This can be frightening and depressing. Even a harmless illness can upset us if it demonstrates our physical vulnerability. Severe psychosocial events such as separations, dismissals or insults affect us even more when they interfere with our usual life and question our self-image. This is helped by the fact that our self-image is not free of interpersonal and cultural influences. We need the respect of fellow human beings to stabilize ourselves, just as we need air to breathe. This is why a burden only affects us and not others is particularly difficult to bear. We are then the exception and fear to lose recognition. For example, it has been empirically proven that isolated job cuts make affected people more depressed than job losses due to the closure of entire companies despite similar financial difficulties. The reactions to the corona crisis suggest a similar response pattern. Hence, the first lockdown was perceived by most people as a necessary defense reaction to an acute threat. People did not feel affected on their own, but as a collective, and helped each other. Although most people's self-image was threatened by an unexpected appearance of the virus, this threat was diminished by the collective concern and the solidarity experienced. After the lockdown, the situation changed. The worst seemed to be over, but the threat was still there subliminally. The preventive measures taken maintained the physical distance, but also tended to increase the social distance. Psychologically, it is understandable that in an acute stress situation, defense forces are mobilized, but afterwards, when the threat is less visible and seems to diminish in the long run, the same resources are no longer available. The continuing restrictions tire. In addition, solidarity decreases as a result of increasing insecurity. This uncertainty has been exacerbated by the fact that experts have been contradicting each other. The initial consensus frayed. Moreover, the negative economic impact of the lockdown and of the subsequent preventive measures was felt much strongly. There were and are more people unemployed and more small and medium-sized enterprises whose business is threatened. The stress levels are rising. What we know from previous studies proved to be true, that even in times of war, when a population is united, mental disorders don't increase as significantly as in times of economic crisis and social insecurity. It was therefore to be expected that there would be more mental illness as a result of the continuing economic burden of the pandemic. The first empirical findings are now available. In Germany, the frequency of mental disorders in the population was investigated in a representative study both in April 2018, that means before the lockdown, 2 years before, and in April 2020, which is during the lockdown. The differences were small. There are preliminary results on the phase after the lockdown. General statements are therefore only possible to a limited extent. However, according to international studies, the occurrence of anxiety disorders and depression have increased in certain risk populations, namely in those already suffering from SARS-CoV-2, their relatives, and in people under quarantine. The number of mental health problems is also increasing among those in need of care in nursing homes and among medical staff. I experienced this on a small scale in my own everyday life as a therapist. How the persistent insecurity is endured depends on the personality and on a person's social integration. People who have little self-confidence and base levels of trust are particularly vulnerable in time of crisis. They have a poor ability to cope with an ambivalence and run the risk of becoming either depressed and anxious or of projecting the danger in order to maintain control. This is where the well-known defense mechanisms, projecting a scapegoat, comes into play. It is easier to blame others than to be exposed to uncertainty and have to question oneself. That is the temptation of conspiracy theories. Psychologically, it is aggravating that we were not prepared for such a crisis. The level of entitlement and ambition also plays a role, at least in our part of the world. In recent decades, we have gotten ever greater expectations, not only of ourselves and other people, but also of technology and science. Then, suddenly, this breakdown. All of a sudden, our expectations were disappointed. And the disappointment grew even greater the more we hoped for a quick end to the crisis. As in every crisis, but especially in this fundamental one, we must ask ourselves what conclusions we can draw from it. A certain deceleration would not be the worst things. But I also see a great danger that after the immediate threat, we will step on the gas again and make up for what we missed before, until we are back to the old style. I sometimes experience this pattern in my therapeutic life. When patients come out of depression, some try to immediately make up for everything that was not possible before. That is understandable. But without a change in their lifestyle or preventive measures, they risk new depressions. Based on this experience, I am only moderately optimistic that the corona crisis will be managed sustainably. It would be necessary to adjust our self-image, including our self-centeredness. But this is a lengthy process. Let's hope that a fresh start can still be made. Thank you for your interest.